The history of black people in West Virginia is an interesting history in terms of um, the fact that when West Virginia was a part of the Virginia Commonwealth before 1863, there weren't many blacks in this part of Virginia because you didn't have the large slave plantations, the tobacco plantations that really littered the land of the Virginia Commonwealth. But there were some blacks, and they were slaves. In 1860, of the roughly 20,000 black people that were in this, what we know as West Virginia now, over 18,000 of the 20,000 blacks, they were slaves. And so after the Civil War ended and blacks had been freed, most of them left West Virginia. Then they repopulated West Virginia as a result of the coal boom in the southern West Virginia coal fields and some in the north, particularly in the south. And as the coal baron and operators sent their recruiters to south to recruit men to come into the southern West Virginia coal fields and work in the mines. At the same time, they sent their recruiters into southern and eastern Europe and brought in many Europeans as they possibly could. So southern West Virginia was one of the most diverse places probably in the South. And that was done by design because you had these blacks from the South that could be distinguished by their skin color. You had the Appalachian whites that they could be distinguished by their skin color. And then you had the Europeans that could be distinguished by their dialect. And they created segregated housing in the coal camps in hopes of keeping these groups from communicating and coming together to join John L. Lewis's United Mine Workers of America. And so that was the ploy, the strategy that was used by the coal operators. The blacks came in like they do anywhere else, and they excelled at it. They excelled as coal miners. They excelled in every job that they were given. And they helped to build the coal industry, and they built towns, and they built churches, and they built families, and there was a thriving black proletariat in the South. And so as you move from the 1890s, 1900s, moving up to 1914, around that time frame for World War I, and many blacks went off to battle. Blacks have always served in the military disproportionately to their representation in the society and died and been wounded. But when blacks came back in many parts of the country after serving as officers in the segregated military, they weren't wanting to come back and be second-class citizens, right? And so this led to tremendous tension all over the country. And there were riots in cities all over America as these blacks were coming back and saying, we're not going to take being treated this way and so forth. So in West Virginia, they had this small population of black people. They were concerned that riots might happen. So what they did, the legislature passed a piece of legislation in 1919, and they created the West Virginia Bureau of Welfare and Statistics. I'd never heard of that until my good friend Ron Wilkerson gave me a book by a professor, Dr. William Trotter from Carnegie Mellon University. He'd written this incredible book, Coal, Class, and Culture. He tells the history of how blacks were settled in the southern West Virginia between 1890 and like 1930 and 1940. It's a marvelous book, incredible book. And so Trotter explains what happened. So then he talked just briefly about the West Virginia Bureau of Welfare and Statistics. And I'm intrigued by it, and he has these footnotes by it, and he says, it says they can be checked out of the Cultural Library. And so I go up to the library, and I say, I'm looking for these books. They go upstairs, and they bring back, I think it was maybe 12 of them, books, little small books. And it was done every 2 years. And here's what the legislature did. In 1919, they passed a law, implemented in 1921, that every 2 years, the West Virginia Bureau of Negro Welfare and Statistics would have to put together this report about Negroes. It was a census every 2 years. Every black doctor, every black lawyer, every black accountant, every black business, every black church, anything about black people, they was collecting information. They wanted to keep surveillance on what black people were doing. It's incredible. So what ends up happening, a man by the name of Dr. C.F. Hobson, who lived on the west side of Charleston, who was a medical doctor, they made the mistake of giving Hobson the job. So Hobson recruited people from all over the state. He organized the entire state of West Virginia. He used the state of West Virginia and the fact that he had to collect all this data to organize blacks to know each other, to know who was doing what in every part of the state, and to figure out how to work more together and how to do commerce together. Blacks have never been as connected as they were during that period of time. And you have to go and look at those books. There's nowhere you can go now and get one document and get every black lawyer, every black attorney, every black accountant, every black business, every black hotel, every black barber shop, every black beauty shop, every black funeral home. They were, every year, every 2 years, they collected in this report. So this goes on to 1954. And I think that's the last time, maybe there was a book in 56, may have been the last one. And so now with desegregation and integration, and it's obvious that blacks are not going to fumate any riot or rebellion in the state of West Virginia because the numbers are too small. That fear no longer existed among whites, and so they discontinued it. This is 1956. So now the civil rights movement is starting though, right? 54, Brown v. Board, Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, right? Segregation schools are unconstitutional, right? So now you have this massive resistance. Arkansas shut down most of their public schools for 2 years. Part of the Virginia Commonwealth, they refused to let their kids to go to school for 2 or 3 years, right? Black kids, some of them never went back to school. This is how much they resisted integration. Few other states just closed the school system. And that's when they started creating these academies, these Christian academies, supposedly, so that these white, supposed Christian people could go to these high-performing schools, not because of the race issue, because we wanted to have a Christian-centered education. And so, so now turbulence is starting to ferment around the country. In 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, and you have Martin Luther King catapult as this dynamic, articulate young leader. And so then the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the most incredibly successful things in history, where 40,000 black people didn't ride a bus for almost a year until they forced the city to come to negotiate, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional then to be segregated bus travel because they're receiving federal dollars. And so now in the 50s, you start having more things happening, right? Just before the Montgomery bus boycott is the Emmett Till situation. People fail to realize that may have been real, the catalyst that ignited everything. When Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi for speaking to a black woman. That was just 3 months before the Montgomery bus boycott, to a white woman, I'm sorry, for speaking to a white woman. And so this is happening in the 50s. And I'm going somewhere with this, right? And so now you have desegregation taking place, schools been integrated, and racial tension is also still in the atmosphere. So in 1961, West Virginia decided, well, we need to pass a Human Rights Commission, right? So they passed the West Virginia Human Rights Commission. And so it's supposed to be this watchdog for human rights and protecting the human rights of the citizens of the protected classes and making sure that people have a fair opportunities at employment, at housing, and in public accommodations. So it gives another state institution to kind of take a look what's going on with black people. And so that's in 1961. Human Rights just had their Civil Rights Day just a few days ago last week. I think 63 years now they've been in existence. And so the Human Rights Commission sort of is the official state organization that's supposed to be concerned about the human rights and about the civil rights of blacks and other protected classes of individuals. You can evaluate for yourself in terms of how effective it is. So we move forward from 61, you got the Human Rights Commission. So then there's not a lot of real activity to really move a civil rights agenda in West Virginia during that period of time. But then you come all the way until the 1960s, and there's a little bit of turbulence, right? The 60s is turbulence because now you got television, you got Jet, and you got Ebony, and you got some black people going to D.C. and to Detroit and some of these other cities, and they're saying that the black people starting to flex their muscle a bit, and they're starting to express themselves more. And there are a few little things that happen here in Charleston, more activity at WVU in terms of students up there organizing and trying to force that university to be more open to diversity and to be more hospitable and to treat its black students more fairly. And that was some of the major activity that took place in the 1960s. So if I can kind of fast forward, really all the way up into 2000, right? And so in 2002, I gave a speech at the Unitarian Church right across the street. Did not know it would attract so much attention. All this data that came out, the census about the over-incarceration of blacks in the state of West Virginia, the black students were the poorest performing children in the public school system, about the health disparities that existed, that blacks had a low life expectancy. All these things came out at one time. I had all these reports I'm looking at. And I said, I need to put all this stuff together. I put it together in a speech, and I gave this speech about crisis in black communities in West Virginia. Does anyone care? The press covered it, did a big article about it. Kerry Webster was at the time represented the 37th legislative district, I think is what we were called. And she took her job seriously. She heard about my speech, saw the article, said, can you give me the notes to that speech? I said, sure. I gave him the notes, my outline, and I didn't know what she was going to do with it. She took that information, got some information from a friend of mine, Rona Taylor Williams, who would collect some information about black business, and put together House Concurrent Resolution 76 and introduced it into the legislature, calling for them to take a look at some of these challenges. They passed a resolution in February, March of 2002. July the 15th, 2002, they called for a hearing, the Legislative Oversight Commission on Human and Resources Accountability, LOCRA. And they brought in all these state agencies, and they had to come in and give a report on what's the status of blacks. And it was, you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife, and all these state agencies came in and basically just corroborated everything that I had said in my speech, because I was taking it from documents that the state had produced. So Kerry, our Delegate Webster, then got them to put that together, and she said, we need to do something. So then, in the 2003 legislative session, she introduced legislation to create the Select Committee on Minority Affairs B, interim study. She said, we need to study this, right? And so the legislation passed. The Democrats had control of the House and the Senate. They also had control of the governor's office. So the legislation passed. Bob Wise was the governor. So in 2003, during the legislative interim, they had these hearings. They brought in these state agencies. They brought in college presidents, particularly from Western State University and Bluefield State, and different groups came in and gave testimony and put this stuff all together in a big report. Then they summarized the report and the findings, and they divided their work up into four major areas: education, employment and economic development, health disparities, right, and juvenile and adult criminal justice. And they collected all this data. They then summarized it, and 23 specific findings of facts of how bad things were for blacks in the state of West Virginia. 36 specific recommendations of things that should be done to address these issues. Now, we think we're getting ready to go somewhere. We got a Democratic legislature, we got a Democratic governor. And they present these findings to Governor Bob Wise. And he says, well, I don't know if this is actionable or not, and I don't know if I should be engaging with the feds. Well, there's some rigmarole that he gave, reason that he didn't basically do anything with the report. It's sort of like the Kerner report. It came out in 1968. After all the riots in 65, 66, 67, they come up with the Kerner report, and they come with all these recommendations, and it summarizes and says we have two separate societies, one black and one white, and they're anything but equal. And they submitted to Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he did nothing with it because he was angry with Martin Luther King for coming out against him against the Vietnam War after him pushing the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and even though the Fair Housing Act of 1967 was defeated by the Democratic Southern legislators, Johnson was still smarting over the fact that King had dared to speak out against the war. And so anyway, so Johnson wouldn't even bring the people in to talk to them about the Kerner report.